What to do, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the debut album by gangsta rap group N.W.A. Basically, they're a West Coast highlight. They definitely have a lot of heralded music, and this album is called Straight Outta Compton, and it came out in the summer of 1988. And basically, the thing about it is this is a very revolutionary album. They do have another album that came out before this one. It's an off-the-side album called N.W.A. and the Posse, and that project came out in 1987. But basically, N.W.A. manifested between like the mid late 80s, 1986, 87, somewhere in there. And the initial group, this is one of the most revolutionary rap groups of all time. And in a lot of ways, a lot of times, folks like Rolling Stone and those type magazine and official kind of publicities for music critique and that type of stuff will say that this is one of the biggest rap groups of all time, if not the best one. That just kind of happens to be a thing. So this is a pretty revolutionary album. This is definitely from a from an impact standpoint and the stuff that it did for rap music. This is probably a 5-star album, and I would have to say, from an impact standpoint, this is probably a 5-star album, and it just did a lot. It really helped. It really helped take things in a different direction from the strictly East Coast kind of movement that had happened throughout the early and mid 80s and stuff. So this is kind of a breath of fresh air in a lot of ways, and it managed to kind of mess around and truly get like things up and up and going, especially in the California scene. So all of these rappers are notable when you think of Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, MC Ren, Ice Cube, and even DJ Yella, the DOC, and Arabian Prince, and some of them. There's just a lot of stuff on here that kind of, these were the guys that were at the forefront of rap music for a good while. And really, this particular sound that happened between like 1987 and about 1995, 96 or so was just pretty central in rap music. And this is definitely a golden age of rap album. This is definitely one that I think had a lot of heralded praise that just continued to get a lot of good, like DAP and things like that. This overall positive critique and just overall rave reviews and that type of stuff. But this is a pretty central album. Now, looking back on it, despite all this rave stuff, I'm sounding like I'm going to give this album like an 8, 9, or a 10 out of 10. It's going to get kind of a mediocre score, but it's just because it just didn't stand the test of time. I feel like there are songs on here that are extremely good, but this is not like wholesomely the best produced album. Like I probably feel like Niggas for Life, their 1991 album, is probably better produced. Dr. Dre really started to find himself as a producer. And I also would have to say, I think I like the beats on 100 Miles and Running better than this one. But this one is more revolutionary. This one had more impact and controversy attached to it, just with songs like Fuck the Police and the Straight Outta Compton title track. And really, some fun facts about N.W.A. is just the fact that, like, they got a warning letter from an FBI agent about the controversy that they were causing. Cops did not want to perform at the N.W.A, or cops did not want to be security at the N.W.A shows because of the Fuck the Police song. And MTV refused to play their Straight Outta Compton music video because they didn't like the controversy that they were kind of doing. So really, this group did not really get a ton of airplay, and they were pretty much strictly popular and became platinum because of word of mouth type stuff. So that's definitely kind of the thing. Like they were the first gangsta rap album. Yeah, they were the first gangsta rap album to go platinum, which means to sell 1 million copies if you didn't know that. So it's got a lot of good stuff to talk about on this project. But we'll go ahead and get into it so I can get to talk about some of these moments. So basically, there were 3 singles off this project. The first single was Straight Outta Compton, the title track. And this Straight Outta Compton was the first single. And this one's a very rousing, cityscaping tune. Definitely has some Traverse and Aaron's type feel towards it. Just a very thumping kind of pounder of ones. Kind of controversial because it didn't get airplay and they wouldn't airplay these songs. But I do kind of look after it as just being able to say that this has a lot of highlights as far as being able to talk about it. I definitely see this as a pretty solid city tune. It's definitely one for just getting errands done and just kind of going throughout the city and some of those type moments. But it just has like a real kind of pounding production, just really kind of dramatic. It just feels like it's coming through a bullhorn or something. Just sounds like some city noise and that type stuff. I definitely like this concept just because this is what kicked off gangster rap in a lot of ways, just because the feel-good tunes of like the Beastie Boys and Run DMC and some of those type folks from the early and mid 80s, and even LL Cool J and some of them. These guys were pissed off, they had attitude, and they just overall kind of played that format pretty well. And they just had a lot of like riotous kind of energy that made them quite controversial, and it was just different from the stuff that had basically been seen up to that point. Brilliant debut single. This kicked off a genre and a subgenre in a lot of ways, and is a pretty revolutionary song. If they had more songs like this, I definitely wouldn't have a problem with giving this album a 10 out of 10. This is just a fantastic debut single. This is just a fantastic debut single and probably a highlight just even today in California rap music. It's just too bad that Dr. Dre's not on here, but MC Ren, Ice Cube, and Eazy-E all do a great job. This is just a easy breezy kind of one. Gangsta Gangsta is the second single, and this is a very breezy, summery city day kind of whimsical type song. I definitely like the kind of breezy kind of feel towards it. Not quite as thumping and as rousing as Straight Outta Compton, but definitely just kind of a weaving in and out throughout the city kind of tune. This really kind of feels like one where you're just kind of cruising around or walking around, just kind of the traverse of some of that type stuff, and just kind of seeing like the city lights and that type of stuff. I mean, it can be a city night kind of tune, but this is overall just kind of appreciating the sights and just kind of being not at home and just kind of having more stuff to do across going throughout the city and stuff. Definitely a nice tune for even New York City, San Francisco, some of those places where there's a lot of buildings and you can just kind of weave and get yourself like a hot dog or some Lay's potato chips and that type stuff just to kind of do some of those things. It's just an interesting one. Definitely kind of, I like these city tunes from N.W.A. I've said that before. The third single is Express Yourself, and this one has Dr. Dre on here. Dr. Dre is not on this album in an overabundance, but this is definitely a good song by him. Doesn't really have bad language on it, but it is a pretty commercial. This is probably the most commercial of all the singles from N.W.A. It seems interesting that they at least tried to eventually chart. They probably started to realize that they needed to do more songs like this song in order to get airplay, because Straight Outta Compton and Gangsta Gangsta and Fuck the Police were a little bit revolutionary. But this is an example of one that's pretty radio ready, kind of gangsta rap and that type of stuff. Dr. Dre just kind of breezes right through it. It's just a really kind of Cali feel kind of song, definite West Coast 80s highlight. Just would have to say this seemed like it had a lot of star power throughout the late 80s, early 90s, that type of stuff. It's just an overall highlight for that kind of, that happens to be the concept there. I definitely like Dr. Dre on this tune. This is just an overall good one. It's pretty dope that this is a solo song of his. Originally, I thought that this was on like The Chronic or something when I first heard this song like 20 something years ago, or approximately 20 years ago, that type of stuff. It's just interesting to kind of get it. But so I'm going to go ahead and recommend the 6 songs out of 13 I recommend to you, and then we'll get to talk about some of these. So out of 13 songs here, the 6 I recommend. So they would be Straight Outta Compton, Gangsta Gangsta, Fuck the Police, Express Yourself, If It Ain't Rough, and Parental Discretion is Advised. So Fuck the Police is a downtown slash uptown kind of song. Definitely either way, if you're downtown or uptown, I think this is a good one to kind of be in throughout the city and that type of stuff, just walking around and traversing and some of that. Definitely has an errands kind of feel towards it, but it's also kind of controversial. It's also kind of controversial, obviously, just because of the title being "Fuck the Police" and their uh, lyrics against the boys in blue and that type of stuff. So I just would have to say the concept behind it, this definitely sparked a movement in like the 80s in California and that type of stuff. And probably it was eventually heightened later on, a few years later, with like Rodney, I think with Rodney King and some of that type of stuff from like, Rodney King from like 1992. So California was dealing with that sort of stuff. There just were plenty of situations that kind of happened throughout that traverse between like the late 80s, early 90s. This is just one of those that was really controversial back in the day when you would see rap songs on the news. Is usually for songs like this and that type of stuff. But this is just an example of something that really got them some good airplay and press before the internet was kind of around and stuff. This is a nice one, but it is a pretty uptown, downtown kind of tune. I do like the concept of this kind of the light guitar licks on here. The light guitar licks in the verses and Fuck the Police just make it a really kind of breezy summer type tune. So I do like that one. All of the first 5 songs on Straight Outta Compton kind of have that breezy, summery kind of city feel. So a lot of these are just meant for errand running and going out and about and kind of buying like Cokes and nachos and Lay's potato chips and some of those type moments. They just really have a nice weaving in between the city kind of feel. But another one that's a nice one is If It Ain't Rough with MC Ren. This one's just kind of like a lazy summer day type tune. Definitely a traverse one. I mean, I would have liked like Ice Cube or someone else on there. Definitely Eazy-E also. But for what it is, this is a pretty solid one just for doing that. It's just another kind of song that's very similar to Gangsta Gangsta and Fuck the Police. These are just both pretty rock solid highlights for this album. I definitely like this kind of city feel. That's one thing about this N.W.A album is it has a lot of social kind of moments towards it. It just has that overall city kind of stepping out kind of feel. I mean, it doesn't have dance club moments, or this album doesn't have dance club moments and nightclub moments, but it definitely has like the kind of traverse through the city and Aaron running really down pat. And I just would have to say these are some good ones. And then the third song I recommend to you that's not one of the singles is Parental Discretion is Advised. Now this has all of the N.W.A members on here, plus the DOC from 1988. Getting a 1988 verse of the DOC on here was a pretty nice touch. So this one to me is like a hole in the wall kind of downtown kind of feels. Definitely a thumper, but it just kind of feels more of like a hole in the wall kind of spot where, some of those bars that you go to that just don't have that many people, or just the drinks are cheaper and some of that type stuff. Just easier kind of places, nice bar hopping, pub crawling type stuff just for doing that sort of thing. Definitely a downtown kind of feel. This has real kind of thumping, kind of bass heavy kind of energy on there. It's just a nice kind of crawling one. So I like that one. That's just kind of the concept. But to kind of talk about the other 7 songs, like a lot of these, some of these were kind of disappointing. Talk about the 7 songs out of 13 I didn't enjoy. Some of these were kind of disappointing. Like all of the remixes I really didn't enjoy. The 8-Ball remix, Compton's in the House remix, and Dope Man remix all kind of dropped the ball. They just had pretty bland and uninteresting productions. This were not anything noteworthy to speak of. I'd probably have to say that the original 8-Ball that was on N.W.A.'s 1987 album was better, and they probably should have just thrown that song on here because these remixes just didn't do this album justice. And there's just a lot of dud songs on here. Like I really felt like a terrible one was Something to Dance to. So a pretty terrible song on here was Something to Dance to. This one was just not jivey at all, and the beat in the verses was just not that interesting. And the way that they kind of had Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, and Arabian Prince kind of interspersed their verse all together in one verse, and both the first and second verse was just not interesting. It just did not come off as compelling at all. It was really kind of a disappointing song, and I was really expecting something better from them in terms of something jivey and more dance club kind of related, but that's pretty much one of the worst beats on the album. Quiet on the Set and I Ain't the One. Another disappointing one was Ice Cube's solo song, I Ain't the One. This one's trying to be a ladies song, but just had a pretty terrible production on there, and it just wasn't. It was kind of a chore to listen to and just wasn't compelling. I already talked about the remixes being disappointing. There just were some kind of duds on here. Like another MC Ren only song was kind of a dud. This one probably should have just followed the format of If It Ain't Rough, because this one just was kind of another pill to kind of listen to. Some of these were just kind of, I would just have to say that basically most of the second half of the album, past like song number 5, most of this album is pretty bunk and just has a lot of just kind of piss poor, kind of disappointing, and just overall kind of lackluster productions that are just not interesting. And the overall impact of their hit songs like Gangsta Gangsta, Straight Outta Compton, Express Yourself, and Fuck the Police, they just kind of lose that mixture. And they should have done what they kind of did with those initial 5 songs. I kind of feel like the impact, like they should have had some songs with Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, and Ice Cube. Should have had some songs with MC Ren and like Eazy-E and some of those type moments. Just something, I feel like the concoction minus like the initial 5 songs that you hear, the ways that they kind of labeled these artists and meshed these artists together, it was just not concocted enough. They tried to give certain folks some shine and it just didn't work. And my biggest complaint about the second half of the album would just have to be the lackluster productions. I mean, it just was not anything that really felt interesting to kind of listen to. I mean, I admit that Dr. Dre was kind of in his early stages as far as like a producer, but I just look after it. I listened to some of the best songs on this album, and I wonder why there couldn't have been like 5 or 6 more songs like that. I mean, you listen to a pounder like Straight Outta Compton or a breezy kind of, intriguing and kind of compelling sample song like Express Yourself, and I just don't see beats like that throughout the rest of the albums. I don't know if Dr. Dre and DJ Yella ran out of steam or something like that happened, but it just feels like the initial 5 songs are great. The initial 5 songs are great, plus Express Yourself later on, but they just ran out of steam pretty quickly. And a lot of these just do not hold a candle to the best beats that they have. And I just felt like they should have definitely had some more rousing city tunes and some dance club moments that hit hard, and just overall things like that that could have like really sharpen the impact of it. Now, this will always remain a revolutionary album and it'll always have its impact and notoriety for it, but it's just too bad that, 30 something years later, 35 years later, the test of time just is not quite as strong just because you look after, there's just a lot of duds on here that I think most people, when they talk about this project, are singing the praises of the singles. So that just kind of happens to be a thing. But in terms of what I'm going to score this project, me liking 6 songs out of 13, I'm going to give this album a 4.75 out of 10. I mean, I feel like that's about as much as I could do with it. I feel like the impact of it was pretty severe, and I liked all 3 of the singles, plus the kind of controversial song Fuck the Police, but there's just not nearly enough on here. And I just feel like the execution and how it was handled in terms of varietizing this stuff with the production and the way that the rappers kind of came off to have their spark just did not really glorify it correctly. So I give it a 4.75. The social score, though, I will give a 6.5 out of 10, just because that was really impactful and it really felt like a nice social jolt of energy cruising through California cities and that type stuff. Just hot summer, lazy summer days and some of those type moments. And even in New York and East Coast places, Philadelphia, some of those places, I feel like some of this stuff could really hold true there as well. But in terms of the future, that's kind of difficult just because Eazy-E is deceased and N.W.A disbanded back in the early 90s, which is over 30 years ago. But I just would have to say this is definitely a rock solid debut in terms of critique and just overall impact, but it just leaves a lot to be desired looking back and, delving into it and dissecting it a little bit more. But the singles are brilliant and there are some songs worthwhile on here for a solid purchase. It's just not a full blown classic minus the impact it had.